Cette conférence va maintenant être enregistrée.
Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ian Cochran. I'm a senior advisor at I4C, Institute for Climate Economics, and I have the pleasure to introduce today's webinar and welcome all of you to the conversation. We should have a few more people joining, but we'll just get started with some of the introductory remarks before we dive into the presentations and the discussions that we have in store today. So this webinar is building off of a project funded by EUCI, the European Climate Initiative, which is part of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Natural Conservation and Nuclear Safety. And this project has been focusing on developing capacity and literacy on climate finance and investment related topics, specifically within the Central European area. And as part of this project, we held a workshop in Berlin last March, where we launched an EU contact group on the questions around the financing and investment of the energy transition. And as part of this contact group, we, and when I say we, I should also mention our other partners of the project, WISE Europa, based in Poland, and the New Climate Institute, based in Germany. We have put together, or in the process of putting together, a series of webinars that will serve as a basis for conversations, exchanges, and potentially the development of future work among those parties interested in this topic. So today is the first webinar of this contact group. We're really excited to give this model a test and to see how we build on it in the future. So please feel free to join into the conversations and jump in as we move forward, as again, this is kind of our first test of seeing how to hold these conversations somewhere on the border between technical exchanges and discussions on how to better integrate this work into different political and decision-making processes. So to give you an overview, just one second, let me advance the slides, of what we'll be doing today. Today's webinar, will be moderated by myself, Ian Cochran, and I'll be joined by two speakers, Hadrian Hainaut from I4C Institute for Climate Economics, and then Alexandra Novikova from ECEM, based in Germany as well. And we'll be presenting two country-focused pieces of work. So the updated results from the I4C Landscape of Climate Finance in France, which was released earlier, or actually last October, and then the English language translation earlier this month. And then we'll be hearing from ECEM about work that they've conducted in updating available data in Germany. And I think we'll be specifically hearing a bit about the building sector. And then we'll have an opportunity to discuss a report that was just released, I think last week, yes, last Friday, or 2 Fridays ago, that has done a first comparison of both the methodological approaches used in France and Germany, and an assessment of the initial results that we can compare given methodological differences, and then the identification of areas where further work is needed in order to be able to compare results from the different assessments. We then will move into a discussion where we hope to engage with all of you about some of the work that you are doing in this area, particularly attempting to identify today where we might see convergences as well as continued divergence in terms of practice on the tracking of climate-related investment and finance, and then attempt to understand how I might be able to improve and continue to improve on methodologies so that they can also improve policymaking and the assessment of the climate finance and investment gap. We'll then finish with a few conclusions out of today's discussion and next step, particularly, and I'll flag it now, but we'll go into more detail at the end of the call later, that we'll be doing a second webinar in about a month's time that will be focusing specifically on work that's being finalized right now around different Central and Eastern European countries. So with that note, I think we may jump directly into the content of today's webinar. So I'll hand things over to my colleague, Hadrian Hainaut, to walk us through the most recent results of the French landscape. And Hadrian, just let me know, I'll advance the slides. Please just say next slide when you'd like me to move forward.
Okay.
Oops.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hadrian Hainaut, and I'm happy to present the highlights from our latest edition of the Landscape of Climate Finance in France. So the Landscape is a comprehensive study of domestic financial flows in favor of climate and the broader energy transition in France. The work we conducted in 2019 was done with the support of the French Energy Management Agency, the ADEME, and of the Ministry for the Environment. It was presented, as Ian said, last month at the National Assembly, because we are doing this work under a general mandate from the French Parliament, which in the French energy transition law has requested for a report, an annual report, to quantify and analyze public finance, assess private finance, and measure the adequacy between current levels of financial support and the requirements to achieve the objectives of the energy transition in France. And so this work is conducted for this purpose. On the next slide, what we found in this study is that investment in climate mitigation in France from households, public administration, and companies reached 46 billion euros in 2018. This represents about 10% of France's gross capital formation, and it has been increasing and even accelerating over time, as we can see on the left-hand chart of this slide. Out of this total of about 46 billion euros, 20 were dedicated to energy efficiency, most notably in buildings, residential buildings, as well as tertiary buildings, the industrial sector, and vehicles, including electrical, hybrid, and natural gas vehicles. Renewable energy reached 7.5 billion euros in investments, both in renewable electricity, such as windmills or solar plants, and in renewable heat, such as wood stoves or heat pumps in houses. Sustainable infrastructure, which includes investment in railways, urban public transport, waterways, and cycling lanes, totaled about 11 billion euros, while nuclear accounts for 7 billion euro out of the total investment. On the next slide, what we remind to all our readers is that this kind of study is limited in its ability to capture what goes on in the entire economy because of sectoral, the variation of sectoral data that we can rely on. So in France, we know very well about the housing, the transport, and the energy production sectors. But in tertiary buildings, the agricultural and industrial sectors, there is a lack of data which limits the assessment to the level of current investment. And we know less about investment needs or fossil fuel investments in such sectors. Investments in research development or adaptation to climate change are not documented in the study because their identification requires methods and definitions that differ widely from what we have in the study at the moment. In the next slide, which is really the key figure of our study, we can see investments represented on the right-hand side, and they are sorted by sector, so transport, industry, agriculture, energy production, and buildings. In the central column, we represent how investments are undertaken by project managers, with the flows being proportional to the amount invested in each sector. So project managers are the owners of the physical capital, such as households in the example of a house renovation. The project managers raise funding from public sources on the left-hand side of this chart. So public sources being, for example, public administration with subsidies shown in blue, or from financial institutions and financial markets with debt flows represented in orange, red, or brown, as well as from the own funds of households or private companies, which are represented in green. Critically, we found that about 50% of all climate funding was conducted by public authorities, either through public investment directly, so the public project managers shown on this chart, or through subsidies and loans extended by public bodies to private project managers, so tax breaks for households or soft loans for corporations, which account in that total. This share of about 50% global is higher in sectors with a history of public investment, such as the transport sector with infrastructure, and it's lower in the private housing stock, because that's where households are doing most of the effort of the investment. On the next slide, what our study showed is that in a further 15 to 18 billion euros per year is needed between now and 2023 to be on track for carbon neutrality in France. So we documented these estimates starting from the French national climate objectives, which are quantified in the national low carbon strategy, the reference scenario of that strategy, as well as the multi-annual energy plans, which are French national documents for energy planification and objectives, energy planning. Based on these documents, we identified which equipment should be deployed in each sector. For example, the number of houses to be renovated, the amount of wind and solar power generation capacity that has to be installed. And we converted these into investment numbers through the current prices of these equipment. We also found in the next slide that when we present these results about investment needs, we are often asked about if the funding should be coming from the public or private sources. So there is an open debate at the moment about how to provide the most efficient and equitable funding for these objectives. In order to contribute to this debate, we prepared a financial flows projection in which each sector achieves the investment objectives that are set in the low carbon strategy by maintaining the proportion between public and private finance that we observe today. In this analysis, we found that the contribution from public bodies should increase by 7 to 9 billion euros by 2023, but it would be matched by an equivalent or even further increase in private investment. So the share of private investment in the total should be increasing overall if we achieve the objectives set in the French national low carbon strategy. Finally, in this study, and this would be my last slide before conclusion, we also looked at fossil fuel investments. So investments in especially the transport sector and vehicles, which are still quite high in France. They are principally concentrated in the purchase of new passenger cars, which have been increasing over the last 3-4 years because of the sales of heavier, more energy-intensive vehicles, which continue to rise, and emissions per kilometer of new vehicles hasn't changed since 2015. So we believe that this result in particular shows that there are still contradictory signals surrounding project managers regarding investment, and low carbon in this sector remains quite a niche at the moment. So to conclude this presentation, you can find more information about our work in our recent 2019 edition summary, which you can access on this link once this presentation is done, and as well as the earlier 2017 report, where we dive into the methodological and policy consideration of each sector covered in the landscape. Thank you very much. So I look forward to answering questions and joining the discussion. Perhaps it's back to you, Ian, at the moment.
Great, thank you so much, Hadrian, for that very succinct overview of the recent developments in work in France. Perhaps we move on, before we move on to Alexandra's presentation, I would just ask if there are any questions or needs for clarification from more of a technical side before we move perhaps later into the meat of the discussion around use in policy, etc. So I guess I'll open the floor to any more technical or questions around specific points for clarification. All right, great. It looks like you were very clear, Hadrian. So I will now move on to, oops, there appeared just to be a run. Sorry, they're running through just the extra slides there that we have for in case we need them for discussion later on. I'd like to hand things over to Alexandra Novikova from ECAM, Institute for Climate Protection, Energy and Mobility. Now, Alexandra, would you like me to make you presenter so you can run your slides?
That's right.
Okay, 1 second. All right, go ahead. I think you should have access to share your screen now.
Okay. Please let me know whether it worked.
Yes, we're seeing it so far, so.
Okay, fantastic.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian, for your introduction, and hello, everyone. It is so great to be speaking to all of you today, and it is really my pleasure to share the results of our recent work on tracking climate finance in Germany. So my presentation features tracking of energy and climate flows in Germany, as well as comparing these flows in Germany and France. The approach of tracking climate finance flows in Germany was introduced by Climate Policy Initiative overall in 2011, as was said by Jan and Hadrian, and these flows were tracked at the global level using the diagram called a landscape of climate finance. And in 2012, the Berlin Office of Climate Policy Initiative converted the global landscape approach into a framework suitable for analysis of climate finance at the national level. And the key study at that time, which we made, was Germany. So at the next slide, you see the first ever landscape of climate finance at domestic level for 2010, which we made about 10 years ago for Germany. And this landscape has served as a prototype for tracking climate finance at domestic level for many countries worldwide. The construction of this map of this landscape uses a bottom-up approach, as it was already introduced by my colleagues. So this bottom-up approach tracks investment at technology level, aggregating it on to sector level, and then ultimately to the country level. So the map allows understanding who invests, so from which sources does the money flow, through which intermediaries, through which instruments, which channels, and finally, where does it end up, in which sector. So at that time, we have decided that the public sources will cover EU budget, federal budget, subnational budgets, and public banks. Private sources will include companies, households, and commercial banks. Intermediaries will include ministries and governmental agencies which serve as intermediaries transferring this money, public banks, commercial banks, and other intermediaries. Instruments are different financial means of supporting climate-specific projects and measures, including grants, concessionary loans, commercial loans, risk management instruments, equity, and others. And channels that we considered that time were agencies, banks, energy-service companies, TSOs, DSOs, and others. So the sectors which we considered that time were energy supply sector and infrastructure, buildings, industry, tertiary sector and transport, and agriculture. Analyzing this map for 2010, we concluded that year, the climate-specific investment in Germany was around 1.5% of GDP. The private sector provided most investment, and mostly this investment was supported by low-interest loans. And the key sectors attracting the most investment were the building sector and the energy sector, in particular, small-scale renewable energy installations. So this was a short introduction of what was made 10 years ago, and this was extremely important to make it for me because it's very interesting how the situation has changed for the recent year for which we updated this landscape. And the next slide will provide you the information how we did it. About 2 years ago, we received some funding from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research under the INAVI platform, for which we decided to try to run this exercise again for the year for which the latest data was available for 2016. And we were thinking how to improve the structure of this tracking, and we decided that for us, channels doesn't make sense to include into the landscape anymore. But we decided to introduce tracking first for one sector, for the building sector in more detail, to see whether the tracking still makes sense and still provides us important messages. And first, we updated the landscape for the building sector, and at the link you can see that you can find the report which we introduced, which we issued that year. And then on the next slide, I will introduce you the work which we were able to build for the whole Germany, which was grounded actually by the work which we have conducted for this one single case study. So the next slide, as you can see on the screen, presents now the broader work which we managed to conduct under the follow-up project funded by the European Climate Initiative of the German Ministry of the Environment. The project called Climate Investment Capacity. And at this project, we broaden our work that was focused before on the building sector, and we replicated it for other sectors. And the landscape, as I mentioned, was modified, including sources of finance, intermediaries, instruments, and recipient sectors, so without channels. However, we introduced one more dimension into the landscape. Now we split the money which go into recipient sectors, into energy efficiency, so renewable energy, and other measures. So the next slide will provide you some key messages of making this exercise for 2016 for the whole Germany. And I will provide some comments for these messages. So what we can see, and comparing to the 2010, is that the largest share of money is still flowing from private sources, and in particular private actors, which are corporations and households, provide more than 80% of the total investment which flows into German energy transition in 2016. However, the next message is how this finance is provided. This finance is mostly supported by the public sector. In particular, the largest share of this finance is supported by concessional loans from the German Bank for Reconstruction and Development, called KfW. And the second important instruments are grants, which support a very large share of finance going, for instance, to the building sector. The next message is that overall, what we calculated that the total investment which flows into the decarbonization of the German economy in 2016 is slightly more than 60 billion of euros. However, we have to be really careful in telling this number, because we have to really think what is behind this number. In particular, if you would go into discussion how much which share of this finance is incremental, and this is particularly the subject for the building sector, for instance, where we can say that whenever the building is low energy, so the whole investment which went into construction is investment into energy transition. This is obviously not the case. In fact, only a fraction of this money could be accounted as actual that is invested into energy transition. And considering only the share of money which goes into incremental or additional flow, which actually does contribute to energy transition, and these numbers could be compared to the landscape of 2010, which calculated also this number. We can see that slightly more than 40 billion was invested in 2016, and that represents about 16% increase as compared to 2010. So what does it mean? This means that we have to be really, as I mentioned, careful in telling the total numbers, and we have to be really careful in looking what kind of additional or incremental investment each study does consider, in order to not misinterpret these numbers. Sorry, somehow my slide doesn't roll down. Yes, what we have learned from this exercise, and we have really devoted a lot of time on thinking whether this could be a good method that we could continue using to track investment into energy and climate transition or not. We have to be honest, it does have some advantages and it does have some limitations, whereas it could be obviously useful for many types of exercises. First, we concluded that an obvious advantage is that it is really a very good visual snapshot of sources of climate finance, of intermediaries, and of all numbers, and where do this money go to. And it's also very easy to understand the ratio of money which go to different sectors and measures, and get a feeling whether there is over or under spending in particular sector or measure. Also, what we have realized when we looked at the French landscape of climate finance is that we can really draw many messages when we compare such flows between countries. So we can really improve our understanding how to finance energy transition in different countries. Furthermore, making the exercise of comparison the maps or landscapes between 2010 and between 2016, we understood that we can understand the progress, how countries improve their financing, whether they provide more money, less money, into which areas, and so on. However, we see that it's really time-consuming exercise how to obtain all the money which will go into the construction of such a landscape, and takes quite some time. And the results do not permit to understand directly what is the impact or effectiveness of climate policy. We cannot directly translate the numbers into leverage of private money by public finance, and we do not clearly get the message on what are the gaps to reach climate targets. So to answer the latter message, we have to understand what is the investment need or investment gap into energy transition, and then compare the landscape of current investment with this investment need assessment. However, these two things then have to be prepared using similar methodology in order to be comparable. So, overall, there are several challenges which are associated with the construction of such landscape. Which we also would like to share. We have to be honest about that. First, the latest data which is available usually to construct such a map. This is like usually we are looking back to 2 years, and sometimes this is quite substantial lag. So we usually need more recent information to make conclusions for policy making. Second is that it is really a challenge to understand for some measures whether we have to track them or not, because there are many climate-related measures, for instance, such as public transport, for which it is not clear which share of finance we have to track. Third, as I mentioned, it is really challenging to understand the share of incremental or additional costs for some sectors. For instance, I give an example of buildings, but it could be equally transportation, which have a huge impact on the total numbers which will be produced. And the last point that at such maps or landscapes, we usually track investment into gross capital formation, so capital expenditure, disregarding investment into capacity building, technical assistance, and other soft measures like information campaigns, research and development, and so on. However, this capex often doesn't happen unless these soft measures accompanied. Means that it is also pretty important to include this into such mapping. However, this hasn't been done yet. That means that in summary, we found that providing maps or landscapes of climate finance or energy and climate investments, as we call them recently in Germany, overall, they are very useful tools to conduct such exercise. For instance, to assist such policy documents as national energy and climate plans, which were recently demanded by energy. The new regulation of the Energy Union, or they could be also very useful in order to comply with the Article 21A of the Paris Agreement, when countries have to report how their climate flows correspond, how their investment flows correspond to climate actions. So this is all extremely, these maps are very useful tools to contribute to these tasks. However, there are many challenges which I just outlined. And furthermore, in order to address these challenges and in order to improve tracking, even in Germany, where we have, I think, one of the best situations with data availability, and overall, Germany is kind of a green lab for global energy transition. Kind of, we are testing many innovative policy instruments and so on. And this is pretty easy to make research on energy transition and climate. Overall, still there are many challenges which we have to address in here. For instance, in order to understand better how to track what is the volume of climate and energy finance from public sources, we have to introduce systematic tracking procedures covering all budgets, federal, regional, and local. So for instance, we could make climate tagging in public budgets and establish annual evaluations which would tell us which share of public expenditure goes to climate actions. Similar, we do lack information of how much money goes from private sources for energy transition and climate actions. And similar, that would be useful to introduce such service and make them compatible with the information of climate expenditure from public budget. And third, we do need more methodologies which would help us to understand and to harmonize across all countries what is climate finance, what are climate specific and climate related measures, in particular in such difficult sectors as buildings and transport, and how to calculate incremental costs for them. There have been recently several studies introduced at the EU level, like taxonomy, for instance, climate finance taxonomy, and some other documents which help to answer some of these questions. However, looking at them, what I see that many of these questions remain open, and we have to continue working and collaborating across EU and other countries how to further work on these questions. And the first step of collaborating and trying to thinking together how to address these questions was our work between ECAM and I4CE. this summer, where we made an effort and tried to compare our systems of tracking climate finance in France and in Germany. And this work was supported also by the German-French Office for Energy Transition, financed by ministries in Germany and in France, related ministries. And I would like to briefly introduce a couple of messages which are the results of this comparison, and looking forward to new landscapes or maps which are coming in Europe in the nearest future in a few months. Like there will be such maps developed for the Czech Republic, for Latvia, and for Poland. We can see that it's really interesting and useful to make such exercise between these countries in order to understand how to make financing of energy transition better. So in terms of methodological comparison, we see that we look at the assessment in Germany and in France a little bit differently. And in particular, what we look differently is how we draw dimensions of tracking methodologies. So in Germany, we tracked finance from sources to intermediaries to instruments and recipient sectors, whereas in France, the tracking is from sources through intermediaries, through project developers, through instruments and through recipients. And as I mentioned before, in German landscape 2010, there was before one more dimension called channels. So why this difference occurs is that in Germany, we did tracking only for 2 years, 2010 and 2016, as I mentioned. In 2016, we tried to improve tracking, but for sure, maybe we could make this tracking even better. For instance, we did not introduce, we did not differentiate the information on investment between where does the money go to, sorry, where does the money coming from, and who actually does invest into particular greenhouse gas mitigation project. So for us, the bucket which called sources is basically a source of money or spendings from the public budget or private sources, such as households and corporations. And public spendings could be, for instance, either direct investment into assets, like construction of buildings, or public finance provided to private and public actors as grants and like purchase of electric cars. In French landscape, it's a little bit different. So this could be expenditure from the EU budget or public tax revenues, for instance. This could be savings of households and so on. So this is really where the money comes from. However, the one more bucket, the dimension of project developers, is actually defined as those entities who are making investments and who are often the owners of this capital assets generated. So this could be municipalities, this could be infrastructure management companies, social housing companies, and so on. So this is one of the key methodological differences between our landscapes. And our plan is to continue cooperation with I4CE, so recommended I4CE, and thinking how to improve tracking. So we synchronize and improve tracking, thinking to which direction does this methodology have to further improve. In the next couple of slides, now I would like to jump into some conclusions between sectors. However, due to some methodological differences, and one of them I presented at the previous slides, I would like to say that we have to be really careful how we interpret these messages. And this is why I didn't put a single number into these slides, because I think it is incorrect to compare exact numbers. However, there are still interesting patterns of investing into energy transition or decarbonization of various sectors, which could be made. So for the building sector, we see that for both countries, for Germany and for France, this is the sector which attracts the largest amount of investment, but it is interesting how different countries support this. So in Germany, the largest The largest flow into the sector is supported by concessional loans, whether in France, these are mostly grants which support this flow. In both economies, so in Germany and France, we see that the largest share of this flow goes to construction of new buildings, whereas the retrofits of buildings, which actually needs much more investment than construction, it is the smallest share of the flow. However, what we see that's interesting in both countries, energy efficiency, so investment into energy efficiency into the building sector is on a rise since about 5 years in Germany and in France, whereas the relative share of buildings integrated renewable energy is on decline. For the industry, we see that this is for both countries a relatively small share in total finance and total climate finance, and this could be explained by data availability, but it could be also explained by relatively low prices for EU ETS allowances, but also that maybe in the industry sector we suspect so more investment is going rather to soft measures, for instance R&D, rather than capital expenditure. For the energy supply and infrastructure sector, we see that the flow of investment into Germany is higher than in France, and this is mostly, as we see, due to the support through different policy instruments in Germany, and in particular through generous support with concessional laws of our German Bank for Reconstruction and Development. For the transport sector, we see that this is one of the largest sectors attracting climate investment in France, but this is not the sector which attracts a lot of investment in Germany. However, this is we are very careful to compare these flows, and we think that this is rather a problem of our tracking methodology in Germany, because we could not identify a share of climate-specific investment in the transport total transport investment, because, as I mentioned, we do miss the methodology how to understand which share of investment for public transport, for railways, for instance, could be tracked here. Overall, comparing the availability of finance data in Germany and France, we see that both countries experience big challenges. However, in France, the situation is maybe slightly better, if I may say so, and this is because in France tracking is required by the law, and due to this fact, there have been some articles supporting close collaboration between public administration and various monitoring agencies, which kind of do their best to provide the data and to cooperate on this assessment. And furthermore, there have been there have been a survey of private investment associated with climate actions conducted also by public agencies, which provide slightly better information. Whereas in Germany, we do miss such data, and our exercise that we have conducted was a pure research project that was not demanded by any law. And in Germany, we do miss this very solid basis for data collection and analysis. This is why we also would like to be very careful in how we introduce our messages, because this is, of course, always a subject of data availability, which we would like to emphasize. What we, however, see that recently the topic of climate finance has become also a priority in Germany, and recently we have received a new unit at the for climate finance responsible for this topic, and we think that the situation overall will improve, and we will understand soon better investment which go to this process. On this, I would like to close my presentation and would like to thank you for your attention, and I am open for your questions together with Ian and Hadrian.
Great, thank you so much, Alexandra, for that overview of both the current state of research, excuse me, in Germany, as well as that insights into the some of the what we can do in terms of comparing between different landscapes today. So what I might do is I'll see just in case. I don't know if there's any clarification questions from anybody that would require just kind of looking back at the slides that Alexandra has presented. All right, great. So what I may ask then is, Hadrian, on that issue of the comparison between the two countries, I don't know if you have anything to add from I4C side in terms of perhaps some of the observations that we saw, either points that you definitely would like to point out on that, or anything additional when thinking more from the French perspective, looking at the German results.
Well, I think for one thing, when we saw the first German landscape and we started conducting the same studies in France, we were intrigued by how to define and measure the role of public bodies in the funding model of different investment, whether it is renewables or energy efficiency or infrastructure. And we noticed that in the earlier studies in Germany, there was a focus on the very high share of private finance in the sources, so really at the left-hand side of the graph, which Alexandra showed a couple of minutes ago. Again, when we look at the left-hand side, we can see quite a large share of investment coming from private sources. But in our work in France, and now it also appears here just below the black box, the public support part is important, because we realize that most of this money is either raised or transferred or organized through public bodies, so public banks or even local governments or the central government just borrowing money to fund through subsidies or loans specific projects. And in France, we concluded that the share of public intervention, what we call being conducted by the public sector, reached about 50% of the whole landscape. And it's a much higher share than in the general economy, we believe, or the general investment, because in the economy in general, there's also a lot of public intervention, but in investment, the share of public intervention looks smaller than that. So we found that this evolution of perception in the two studies is quite consistent, because we are basically, even if there are differences between France and Germany, both countries rely on some form of public support to kickstart investments in renewable energy or energy efficiency. So that was one point that really not only was of concern for us since the beginning, but that has also evolved in our perception over time.
Great, thank you, Hadrian. I think that's a very interesting point, because I think it also then touches on some of the questions as we move forward with these tracking exercises, how they can be used for policy making. Because in some respects, having that better data on the relative shares in public of private often speaks, of course, to this question of, whether the public sector, is doing enough to help support investment, and also particularly thinking of the numbers you showed us, where we saw estimations of how that public support might balloon over time and potentially become unfeasible in terms of the weight of the public budget. And that makes me think a little bit of, for example, that almost case study now of how we saw the renewable subsidies in Spain that were misdesigned balloon over time, and in the end have a significant impact on the Spanish government's budget, and then leading to their actual canceling and the rolling back of some of that support. It really asks that question of how to channel that public support, and then also whether from our end as researchers, whether or not we can begin to measure and identify those markets that are actually functioning without public support. So with the landscape, can we begin to see where we have mature renewable energy markets where a very minimum level of potentially longer term signaling, such as different mechanisms to ensure revenues, whether contracts for differences or feed-in tariffs, etc., are sufficient, and we actually see the market being able to cover some of those upfront capital barriers that historically in the past that have required government's role. So that's just maybe one kind of thought, but I think it, at least from my perspective, asks an interesting question of how can we begin to improve our tracking to understand levels of market maturity in different countries.
Yes.
So we unfortunately have only a short time left for questions and the discussion, but I still am going to put that set of slides back up and the discussion questions that we initially identified for today. So let me just do that real quick. So that was kind of some of the framing we had in mind. I don't know if anybody on the call would like to come in now and say a few words or their thoughts about these issues.
Hi, Ian.
Hi,
it's Sophia from Wise Europe. I could see that there's someone had a question on the chat. I'm not sure if you can see that.
Oh, sorry. Just my screen didn't allow me to see that. So let me go down. So Chavi, do you want to come in and say your question, or? So I guess, or I can just read it aloud, that there's that good question of this question about how Article 2.1c, and I guess in that you mean kind of the mandate that countries now have to be working to align all financial flows and investments across the economy, and how that can be reflected in the tracking methodologies. And there I'm guessing you're touching on that definitional question of how climate aligned finance might be different from some of our historical definitions of climate finance, particularly in that more 100 billion international transfers standpoint. Is that what you had in mind for your question?
Exactly. Like I wanted to know, like, how should we really kind of worry less about sort of double counting finance flows and more about whether financial systems are kind of transforming? So yeah, definitional plus how we integrate these this Paris Agreement 2.1c in our tracking work, in our domestic tracking work.
No, that's a very interesting question. Perhaps we'll just see what questions we have out there before we open around to both the panelists and then everybody else to comment. I don't know if anyone else had any question or comment they want to come in with. Great. Well, I guess we'll just kick it off with that. So maybe just from my perspective, very quickly, I would say that I think with the Article 2.1, let me restart that. I think when we're looking at the domestic climate finance tracking and investment tracking process, in some sense, we're closer in spirit to the thinking I think that we need to see develop around tracking of Article 2.1c than, for example, around the more traditional discussions around climate finance and these international transfers. Because in some respects, this tracking around Article 2.1c is about understanding that what's going on in the real economy and seeing if everything we're doing in terms of investment in finance is supporting that transformation, rather than necessarily really ensuring, such as we're doing, I think, more in at least my interpretation of the 100 billion commitment and the traditional climate finance tracking of ensuring that we're actually providing the funding needed for climate-specific investment in given countries. So, and I'm sure Hadrian could build on this point, in what we've been doing in France, we've seen within our definition of climate investment in finance as tracked, a very, very small share of fossil fuel investment, but we include that because it is part of how the French government is currently structured their climate plan and within the national strategy. And of course, other actors should question and critique that strategy, but if we are just attempting to say within the government's vision of what this transformation will look like within the economy, we do have a difference in terms of the perimeter and what is included in that, in some sense, French strategy-aligned climate finance, and what perhaps we would see in more your traditional climate tracking, finance tracking, where of course we see, no fossil fuel investment, etc. Hadrian, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, perhaps from the gap work we've been doing.
I think Xavi asked about not worrying about double counting. And it's true that when we look at the financial system, since it's a system that is very complex and with flows that go into different institutions many times over, it's often the case that we double count engagements seen in the perspective of different institutions. So a bank lending to another bank, or issuing a bond to another investor. This will tend to be counted many times. But one thing that we can count without double counting is the final investment in capital equipment, that actually decreases the CO2 emissions of countries. And this is where the link persists between the financial system and the real CO2 system. But Article 2.1c from the Paris Agreement suggested we could do more than what we are currently doing, or we can improve on what we are currently doing by looking at not only at climate investment and its funding model, but also looking at the fossil fuel investments, because they are generally, or even in the case of France, we realized they were bigger than climate investment, and in some sectors they are still a majority of what is being bought and installed. So by looking at this second aspect of the funding, we realize that we are still far from the objective, and sometimes both flows increase at the same time, because if the context is friendly to investors, we can see both climate and fossil fuel projects increasing at the same time. And the second thing that we can do on top of what we are doing today is ask ourselves, where are the biggest impacts of current investment, not just in terms of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, but the transformation that it opens for the economy to evolve around. So, for example, we have this. We can feel that investing in sustainable infrastructure has a much more long-term impact because of the role of transport infrastructure in the structure of the economy, than just replace a couple of heaters or having the insulation of a couple of roofs in all buildings that would be destroyed or replaced in a couple of years. So thinking about not just the short-term effect or the known effects, but the ones that are much deeper in the economy, and looking at that transformative aspect of investment would make this kind of work more, I would say, in tune with the spirit of Article 2.1c.
Can I add something to that? This is Sasha and this is Alexandra. Yeah, what I do think that's what for sure we have to improve in our tracking is that in the light of 2.21a is that we have to include soft measures and technical assistance into our landscape, because in developing countries, a big share of laws from developed countries is for soft measures rather than capex. And I think if you would track a share overall of climate finance globally, I didn't actually analyze, didn't read the latest CPI publication, sorry, CPI colleagues for that. But my feeling that if technical assistance would be tracked, that would be probably have a very big share. And these dimensions have to be really improved in our landscapes, right? Jan, Hadrian, what do you think?
I think those are both really good points on the fact that Article 2.1c is looking at, of course, more the transformation, but also expanding out to say we need to look across all levels of activities, as you were saying, Hadrian, but also, as you're saying, Sasha, beyond this focus on this fixed capital and some of these tangible objects, which I think there perhaps from more an investment gap perspective, we still may continue to focus on that end investment need in the real economy, but it's very true. We can't forget all this soft, the soft things we need to fund in order to get the hard things to actually appear on the ground. So that's a very good point, Sasha.
Yeah. Guys, are you going to include the soft stuff into your French landscape soon?
We are considering a couple of things. For example, energy auditing, so the measurement of energy consumption in buildings, which is often done before starting a retrofitting project. We believe that we should be tracking the market for such services and understand who is funding these studies, because a couple of public bodies, especially regional councils in France, consider giving out subsidies for this kind of assessment, thinking that once the house owners have the assessment, they would start retrofitting in a better way or with more ambition. So it sounds like a key element of their strategy, and we could be tracking a bit of that. The difficulty becomes that it's sometimes very hard to measure precisely what was the soft measure being deployed and how much did it cost and what was its relation to the actual project, because we can also see governments or even companies spending a lot on, I would say, general awareness raising on climate change without specifying which projects would emerge from that. And we wouldn't like this kind of spending to be included unless we understand better how it relates to actual projects and how it helps projects get off the ground.
I see. Just to add a little bit, so we saw the express of interest from one of Balkan countries and replicated the exercise, and we have already screened preliminary data in that country. And for us, it was interesting to see that the technical assistance seems to be, well, I wouldn't say higher, but at least as high as capital expenditure investment that flows from other countries. And this is why for us it was interesting to get an opinion whether it makes sense to expand the landscape also to soft stuff. Yeah, so that's a reflection.
Great, many thanks. I wonder if there's any other points that other attendees other folks on the line might want to raise. Well, I know we've run over time, so thank you everybody for joining this call today. I did just want to end on a quick overview of next steps. So in about 1 month's time, we are aiming to hold a second webinar, which would be an opportunity to see some of the progress and insights from the CEE region. And right now we're looking at Wednesday, the 18th of December to hold that. We'll be sending around a save the date and a final invitation soon. And this webinar will be run by our colleague Zofia from Wise Europa, and we hope to be able to have someone from E3G or another structure be on the call to give us kind of perhaps an update on where we are with the new commission and the new parliament around the broader sustainable finance agenda, and then have some new insights from oh, whoops, and that's actually a mistake. We won't be hearing about France's work, updates from I4C's work in France, as that's what we've talked to you today about today. But I think we'll be hearing about the work that's being finalized right now in the Czech Republic, and then also hear a little bit about what we'll be working on in Poland next year, both the New Climate Institute and ourselves with Wise Europa. So,
and maybe Latvia, right?
Yes, maybe Latvia, and we'll see if we can get Latvia as well. So we'll be finalizing the program and discussing that. Since all of this is new work that's just coming out, we'll see what we're able to fit into this session. And then again, we hope to be running these webinars through 2020 as part of our project. So if anyone on the call today is interested in presenting some ongoing work or recently finalized work, either now or that will be finalized in the next couple months, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, as we really hope to just create a platform here to discuss together some of these technical questions moving forward. So on that note, I think I will close today's webinar. So thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to having you on our next call in about a month's time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.